If you are interested in anti-colonial and decolonial thought, or maybe you've been studying indigenous state relations and, find yourself wrestling with the limits of government policy, well, this deep dive is definitely for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Today, we are undertaking a really intense exploration of a core critique in this field, the rejection of what gets termed the colonial politics of recognition.
That's right. And our mission here is really to move past some of the more superficial narratives you might hear around reconciliation or land claims, constitutional rights. We're going straight into the source material that argues quite powerfully, actually, that many well-intended policies, those accommodations offered by settler states like Canada, they often function less as paths to liberation and more as these quite sophisticated mechanisms that actually perpetuate structural dispossession.
So it's a deep dive into how that well-meaning sort of liberal rhetoric can actually mask ongoing colonial power.
Exactly. It's about looking under the hood, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this then. We probably need to set the historical stage first. How did recognition even become the default strategy for managing this relationship?
Right. You have to go back a bit.
If we look at Canadian federal policy, say, before 1969, the approach was just nakedly assimilationist. I mean, frankly, genocidal.
No question.
We're talking about the residential school system, deeply racist and sexist provisions baked into the Indian Act, unilateral land theft. It was just characterized by overtly coercive unilateral colonial rule.
The state's goal during that period, let's be clear, was the legal, political, and cultural elimination of indigenous nations as distinct peoples. Full stop.
But that whole strategy, it kind of crashed and burned in 1969, didn't it? With the introduction of that assimilationist statement of the Government of Canada on Indian policy.
The white paper, yes.
The infamous white paper.
Exactly. It was conceived by Jean Chrétien, who was Minister of Indian Affairs then under Prime Minister Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau, that is. And it was meant as this final attempt to, quote-unquote, resolve the Indian problem.
And the proposal was pretty radical for the time. It aimed to eliminate the Indian Act entirely, abolish Indian status, transform all reserve lands into, privately owned parcels.
Yeah, the idea was basically to eliminate the distinct legal category of Indian altogether. Just fully integrate everyone into the Canadian body politic, problem solved. Or so they thought.
The justification was equality, right? But it was an equality that, as you said, required cultural and political suicide for Indigenous nations.
And that explicit threat that really triggered a mobilization the colonial power just hadn't seen coming. It sparked this unprecedented pan-Indian political movement right across the country, leading to the formation and strengthening of groups like the National Indian Brotherhood, which, later became the Assembly of First Nations.
And they countered the white paper with the red paper, didn't they? Citizens Plus.
They did, which flatly rejected the policy as a clear blueprint for cultural genocide. Is a powerful rebuttal.
And the sheer political force, the unity of that resistance, it actually worked. It compelled the federal government to formally withdraw the white paper in 1971.
Which was huge.
Wow.
And that failure, that public defeat, it really forced the colonial power to fundamentally change its approach. It had to shift away from that explicit, overt exclusion and assimilation.
Towards something else.
Towards this seemingly more conciliatory set of discourses. Words like recognition and accommodation started to become central.
And that's the moment, right? That's the birth of this politics of recognition as the dominant strategy going forward.
That's it. And this shift, it eventually culminates in that landmark constitutional affirmation of existing Aboriginal and treaty rights under Section 35(1) of the Constitution Act of 1982.
Which was a massive change from previous policy, definitely. But it also crucially cemented a very specific framework for how Indigenous nations could engage with the state.
Exactly. So when critics use that term, politics of recognition, they're defining it as this whole range of liberal pluralist models we see today. Land claim settlements, self-government agreements, economic partnerships.
All designed ostensibly to reconcile Indigenous nationhood with the ongoing sovereignty of the settler state.
Right. And the core question these critical sources are asking is, does this framework, which relies entirely on the settler state to grant validation, does it actually lead to freedom? Or does it subtly reinforce the existing power structure?
That's the million-dollar question. And that's the crux of the theoretical problem, isn't it? Which forces us, I guess, to dig into the philosophical roots of recognition theory itself. We need to talk about Hegel, and maybe more importantly, the counter-analysis from Framp's Fanon.
Precisely. because Fanon throws a major wrench into the standard liberal understanding.
Okay, let's start with the basics then. Liberal recognition theory, the kind articulated by thinkers like Charles Taylor, it starts from a premise that seems pretty uncontroversial, based on Hegel. Our identity, our sense of self, it's inherently dialogical.
Meaning, we become who we are through interaction, right? Specifically through getting recognition from significant others in our lives and society.
And if that recognition is denied or ignored or maybe disparaged, what Taylor calls misrecognition, he argues it inflicts, quote, real damage. It's a form of oppression.
Yeah, it traps the individual or the group in a reduced mode of being, as he puts it. So logically, recognition gets elevated to the status of a vital human need.
And the political goal then becomes correcting that misrecognition, ensuring everyone gets the respect they're due. Seems reasonable.
It does seem reasonable, and it works quite well for thinking about, say, interpersonal issues or maybe cultural minority rights or even civil rights struggles within an already established nation state.
But Fanon comes along and says, hold on, why does he insist this model completely fails when you apply it to the specific context of colonialism?
Because colonialism isn't just another form of systemic oppression. For Fanon, it's a specific, totalizing structure of domination.
Yeah.
And crucially, it breaks the Hegelian dialectic.
Okay, Hegel's master-slave narrative. Remind us quickly how that's supposed to work.
In Hegel's famous story, the enslaved person struggles, they risk death. And through that very struggle, they force the master to recognize their self-consciousness, their humanity. And this struggle is supposed to potentially lead towards a future state of mutual recognition, reciprocity. Both parties change through the conflict.
Right. But Fanon says that whole trajectory just breaks down in the colonial situation. Why? Because the struggle is different.
Precisely. Fanon observed that, unlike Hegel's enslaved person who has to fight tooth and nail for freedom and self-recognition, the colonized subject often finds themselves in a different position. They're often set free by the master, as he put it.
Meaning independence is negotiated, or maybe declared through international bodies, not won through revolutionary struggle.
Exactly. They don't necessarily complete that life and death struggle that Hegel thought was necessary to prove their certainty of being to the oppressor, and maybe even to themselves.
And what's the consequence of bypassing that transformative struggle?
It's devastating, according to Fanon. The colonized subject, already, in his words, steeped in the inessentiality of servitude, ends up receiving values, things like political rights, constitutional recognition, that are fundamentally limited. They're constrained by the source of power, the colonial state.
So they get white liberty and white justice, as Fanon put it.
That's the phrase.
Yeah.
Because the terms of accommodation, the terms of validation, they're still determined by the hegemonic partner, the colonizer. So the recognition offered is structurally circumscribed from the outset. It's a conditional freedom offered on the master's terms.
And this leads to what Fanon called those psychoaffective attachments to these imposed, fundamentally unfree modes of recognition.
Yeah.
That's a really dense but powerful idea. How can we sort of make that more concrete for listeners?
Okay, think of it maybe like this. Imagine you're constantly negotiating your worth, your very identity, with an incredibly powerful entity that holds all the cards, defines all the rules. Over time, you might stop trying to define your own value on your own terms. Instead, you start to internalize and maybe even become emotionally attached to the metrics and the processes that the powerful entity uses to measure you and grant you legitimacy.
So in the colonial context, indigenous nations feel pressured, maybe even compelled, to pursue recognition through the oppressor systems, through the courts, constitutional talks, land claim frameworks.
Exactly. They can become dependent on the colonizer's validation, prioritizing engagement with the state's processes over the potentially harder, but maybe more liberating, work of internal autonomous decolonization and self-recognition.
So the focus shifts. It moves away from exercising inherent sovereignty, which exists regardless of the state, towards constantly trying to prove your legitimacy to the very entity whose existence is based on denying that sovereignty in the first place.
You've nailed it. And this brings us right back to that dual structure of colonial power we mentioned earlier, and why liberal recognition models often have these significant blind spots.
Right, the two levels. The structural, political, and economic domination, things like dispossession, control of land and resources, and then the subjective level, the subjection of the colonized person, that internalized need for recognition from the colonizer.
Yes, and liberal recognition models, almost without fail, tend to address the political economy of colonialism only in what philosopher Nancy Fraser called a strictly affirmative manner.
Affirmative. Meaning what exactly? They grant certain rights, offer concessions, maybe allocate some resources.
Right. They tinker with the distribution of goods or status within the existing system. They might try to improve outcomes, but they never fundamentally challenge or transform the generative material conditions, the underlying structure, the root causes that produce those unequal outcomes in the first place.
Fraser made that distinction, didn't she, between affirmative remedies and transformative ones?
She did. Affirmative remedies aim to correct unjust effects, like, say, addressing the symptoms of poverty or poor health outcomes in indigenous communities without really transforming the underlying colonial and capital structures that create those effects generation after generation.
Okay, but let's push on that a bit. What about modern land claims? If a First Nation secures, say, billions of dollars and significant tracts of land through a comprehensive settlement, isn't that inherently transformative? Doesn't that change the generative conditions of poverty and lack of control over territory?
That is the absolute core challenge that these critical anti-colonial sources grapple with. Fraser and others applying her work to colonialism would argue that for the change to be truly transformative, it has to alter the deep-seated structural features of colonialism itself, which are primarily the assumed legitimacy of settler sovereignty over the land and the legitimacy of the capitalist state structure that inherently requires access to indigenous land and resources for its own reproduction.
So, if that land settlement includes, as many do, a clause requiring the indigenous nation to cede, release, and surrender their underlying Aboriginal title and rights,
Then it's arguably not transformative. It might shift who gets to manage certain resources or capital within a constrained framework, but it does so by explicitly reaffirming the ultimate sovereignty of the settler state and extinguishing the inherent indigenous title.
it might institutionalize certain aspects of culture, maybe give some management control over specific parcels of land, but it explicitly protects the overarching political and economic framework of the settler state. Is that the idea?
That's the core critique. Taylor's model, applied here, allows for cultural diversity, sure, but it implicitly requires that the recognized group acquires what one critic called a subordinate articulation with the capitalist state. The fundamental political and economic structures remain untouched, maybe even strengthened by appearing more inclusive.
The structure remains the master, dictating the terms. So the focus on achieving recognition from that structure becomes, in this view, a kind of diversion from the harder, necessary transformative work of dismantling the structure itself.
Precisely. Which leads us perfectly from this theoretical critique into the necessary material critique, and specifically how we need to reframe the concept of primitive accumulation in a colonial context.
Okay, shifting gears slightly here, moving more into political economy. Most listeners probably have some familiarity with the traditional Marxist concept of primitive accumulation, or PA.
Yeah, traditionally Marx used it to describe that incredibly violent historical process, mainly in 16th and 17th century Europe. The enclosure movements, stripping peasants from their land, their means of subsistence.
Forcing them into wage labor.
Exactly. Violently clearing the decks, basically, to set the stage for industrial capitalism. It's usually framed as a past event, a kind of brutal but necessary precondition that happened back then.
But the anti-colonial sources we're diving into here, they demand a pretty radical reinterpretation, specifically for settler colonialism.
They absolutely do. This reinterpretation argues that in the settler colonial present, not just the past event, PA must be understood not as a finished historical event, but as an ongoing structure of dispossession, often violent, sometimes more subtle.
And this ongoing dispossession is fundamental to how colonial and capitalist social relations continue to reproduce themselves today.
It's essential. The methods have definitely evolved, from outright military force in the early days to coercive treaties to legal maneuvers in the courts, and now increasingly through what Marx called the quiet compulsion of economic relations, things like debt, market dependency, resource extraction agreements.
But the underlying goal remains the same.
The argument is, yes, the primary goal often remains constant. The elimination of the native, not necessarily physically anymore, but as a distinct political entity holding inherent title to land. Why? To secure and access the land and resources underneath that title.
And seeing PA as ongoing and structural is key, then, to understanding why indigenous anti-colonial struggles often look different from, say, traditional Western class struggles.
Absolutely. If PA is ongoing and fundamentally about accessing land, then the core conflict in settler colonialism isn't primarily about the exploitation of labor or proletarianization, although that certainly happens. It's about the structural conflict over land dispossession.
Land is the ground zero.
It's the resource, it's the means of production, it's the basis of alternative ways of life, and it's the primary site of resistance. In many Canadian contexts, particularly after the fur trade declined and industrial capitalism took over, native labor often became kind of superfluous to the core capitalist economy. But the need for indigenous land, for agriculture, for logging, for mining, for pipelines, for hydro dams, for urban expansion, that need only intensified.
Okay, to make this material critique really concrete, we need an example. And the sources point strongly to the experience of the Dean Nation in the Northwest Territories, particularly during the 1970s and 80s. This seems like a perfect case study of how the state works to domesticate these kinds of transformative demands.
Yeah, it really is a powerful example. The context back then was incredibly volatile. After 1967, when the NWT government structure changed, you saw this dramatic influx of settler bureaucracy, Southern administrators, and alongside that, mounting pressure for massive resource extraction projects.
The big one being the proposed Mackenzie Valley Pipeline.
Exactly. A colossal project intended to bring Arctic gas south. And the Dean, who were the clear indigenous majority on the land, were facing systemic marginalization, loss of control, and outright land theft to facilitate this development push.
But their response wasn't just, we want a cut of the profits or consult us better. It was something much deeper, wasn't it? Rooted in what the sources call grounded normativity. This seems like a really critical concept for anyone trying to understand decolonial thought. What does it actually mean?
Grounded normativity is essentially a place-based ethics, a worldview derived directly from deep reciprocal relationship with a specific territory over generations. It means the land isn't just inert property or a bundle of resources waiting to be extracted.
Right.
It's understood as a living system, a network encompassing people, animals, plants, water, rocks, spirits, ancestors, and that system itself generates and imposes reciprocal relations and obligations upon the human inhabitants.
So the land itself is the source of law and ethics. It teaches you how to live non-dominatingly, non-exploitatively.
That's the core idea. The land is the teacher. It provides the ethical framework, the legal framework.
Yeah.
So when the Detain responded to the pipeline threat, their political demands weren't primarily based on receiving rights from Canada. They were based on upholding their inherent obligations and responsibilities to their territory, Denenda.
And that led to some pretty radical demands.
Absolutely. The Dean Declaration in 1975 famously stated, "We, the Dean of the NWT, insist on the right to be regarded by ourselves and the world as a distinct people and nation." They explicitly demanded recognition as different people with their own values, laws, and lifestyle.
And this wasn't just symbolic. It included concrete political economic demands.
Very concrete. They demanded the right to retain ownership of their land, a huge territory, to assert political jurisdiction over it, and, crucially, to develop their own economic institutions that explicitly rejected the externally imposed capitalist private enterprise model.
So they weren't just asking for a share of the pipeline revenue or more jobs. They were proposing a fundamentally different way of organizing their society and economy on their land.
They really were. Their detailed proposals, worked out between 1976 and 1981, were incredibly specific and potentially transformative. They envisioned things like setting up community-controlled development corporations, communal enterprises, worker-controlled ventures.
Kind of like co-ops.
Yeah, some models were explicitly influenced by post-independence socialist development efforts elsewhere, like in Tanzania, focusing on self-sufficiency, collective benefit, keeping value within the communities. It was a direct challenge to the predatory private enterprise model the state and corporations were pushing.
Okay, but the moment an indigenous nation makes a claim, like a claim that isn't just about culture or consultation, but fundamentally challenges the capitalist mode of production itself, the colonial state has to react, doesn't it? How did Canada and the GNWT respond to this existential threat to their structural legitimacy?
They responded systematically, deploying tactics to domesticate those claims, following a pattern we see repeated elsewhere. It's quite instructive.
What was the first step?
First, they structurally separated the economic from the political. They simply refused to negotiate political self-determination. They insisted that the Dean claimed to be a distinct nation with inherent political rights was invalid within the Canadian constitutional context.
So right away, the goalposts were moved.
Completely. They effectively separated political rights entirely from the negotiation process. What was left on the table was reduced to a land claim negotiation dealing with land title and compensation, not fundamental political status.
So the initial broad political goal of Dean self-determination was immediately curtailed, forcing them into this much narrower state-defined legal framework focused on property and benefit.
Exactly. And then second, within that narrowed framework, they structurally circumscribed the terms of recognition even further. They made it clear they would only recognize or institutionalize those aspects of Dean culture or governance that could be reconciled with overarching Canadian sovereignty and, crucially, with the predominantly private enterprise mode of organization, as the federal negotiator put it.
So the message was, you can have some cultural expression, maybe some local administration, but your economy must align with the capitalist market. Any alternative non-capitalist economic institutions that challenge private enterprise are off the table.
That was the bottom line. You could be culturally different, but you must ultimately integrate into and not challenge the dominant political economic framework.
And the result of this process, the negotiations started with the Dean demanding recognition as a nation, with the right to build a different kind of society.
And it ended over a decade later with the signing of the Dinamedes Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement in principle in 1988. And that agreement required the Dinamedes to formally cede, release, and surrender their Aboriginal title, their inherent political rights to the land across most of the territory.
That sounds like the absolute definition of a domesticated outcome.
It really is textbook in many ways. They ended up trading away those broad inherent rights and that initial transformative political vision for a much more limited, clearly defined package of land ownership, about 10% of the original claim area, financial compensation, and resource royalties.
So the outcome wasn't liberation, but effectively the incorporation of Indigenous people and their territories into the settler state's capitalist mode of production, facilitated through the very mechanism, the land settlement, that was presented as a way to remedy past injustice.
That's the core argument from the critical perspective. The process didn't halt primitive accumulation. It modernized and legalized it, clearing title for further resource development under state and corporate control, albeit with some Indigenous participation and benefit sharing.
That structural failure of recognition, how it can actually facilitate rather than challenge ongoing dispossession, that's a difficult, maybe uncomfortable truth for many people.
It is.
But understanding this material critique, how the system works on the ground, it helps us understand why the state's more recent discourse around reconciliation often feels so hollow or insufficient to many Indigenous people. Which brings us to the role of resentment, but specifically, righteous resentment.
Right. The whole reconciliation push in Canada really gained steam in the context of heightened Indigenous militancy and activism, especially through the 1980s and culminating in the Oka crisis in 1990, plus numerous blockades and protests.
So things like the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, RCAP, in the 90s, and later government policies like the Gathering Strength Initiative and eventually the Formal Residential Schools Apology in 2008, these were, at least partly, responses aimed at mitigating that political crisis and restoring the state's legitimacy.
That's certainly a key part of the critical analysis. And the argument is that Canada's particular approach to reconciliation achieves this mitigation, this calming effect, partly by fabricating a very sharp temporal divide.
A divide between what?
Between an acknowledged, unscrupulous past, the era of colonial abuses like residential schools, and a supposedly democratic, benevolent present.
So framing settler colonialism primarily as an event that happened back then, rather than as an ongoing structure that persists today.
Precisely. By limiting the primary harms to the past, by saying, for instance, the residential school tragedy happened, it was terrible, and it ended in 1996, the state can perform contrition for past actions.
Which allows it to frame itself as having moved beyond that past.
Exactly. It frames colonialism as something the country is recovering from rather than something it is still actively doing. This framing is strategically crucial.
Why? Because if colonialism is just a past event, the state can apologize for that, maybe offer some compensation for those specific historical harms, and then effectively argue that, okay, we've dealt with the past, the relationship is now reconciled, and further fundamental transformation is not needed.
You got it. The state effectively offloads responsibility for the ongoing structural injustices like land dispossession, jurisdictional conflicts, economic marginalization onto history. It demands Indigenous people reconcile with the past, not necessarily with the ongoing structure of domination.
And this often leads to that emotional critique we sometimes hear in public discourse, right? When Indigenous people or communities refuse to just get over it, or forgive and move on.
Yeah, those who refuse to reconcile on the state's terms, or who continue to express anger or grievance about ongoing issues, they're often implicitly, sometimes explicitly, characterized as suffering from a kind of pathology, like Nietzsche's concept of resentiment.
Resentment meaning like a bitter, powerless, irrational inability to let go of the past, poisoning the present.
Exactly, a backward-looking, unproductive feeling. But the critical sources insist we need to make a very sharp distinction between that kind of pathological resentment and what can be termed righteous resentment.
Okay, so why is this feeling, this anger or refusal, often dismissed as negativity? Why is it actually a legitimate, even necessary form of political critique in this context?
Because righteous resentment, unlike its pathological cousin, isn't just irrational bitterness. As philosophers like P.F. Strawson or even Adam Smith argued, genuine resentment is a moral emotion. It's a reactive attitude based on a perception of present wrongdoing or ongoing injustice stemming from unfair treatment or unjust institutions.
So indigenous people's seeming inability to just move on isn't necessarily a personal or cultural failing.
Not at all. In this framework, it's understood as an effective indication of critical consciousness. It's a sign that people recognize that the structural and symbolic violence isn't just historical, it's operating right now, today, in their lives and communities. Their resentment is a moral protest against ongoing injury.
It's an unwillingness to reconcile with a structure that is still actively causing harm.
Exactly. And that righteous anger, that refusal to accept pacification on the state's terms, is often what fuels direct action, which brings us inevitably to the Idle No More movement.
Right, INM, which just exploded onto the scene in late 2012, early 2013.
It was this massive, decentralized, grassroots mobilization, really unprecedented in its scale and use of social media. And the immediate catalyst was the federal government's Omnibus Bill C-45, the Jobs and Growth Act.
Which contained clauses that significantly threatened to erode Aboriginal land rights, treaty rights, and especially environmental protections, particularly around waterways.
Yes, making it easier for development projects to proceed with less oversight and consultation. INM utilized social media brilliantly with the hashtag #IdleNoMore hashtag connecting people globally. There were teach-ins, rallies, flash mob, round dances, and shopping malls.
But critically, there was also disruptive direct action.
Absolutely crucial. Train stoppages, traffic blockades on highways and bridges, disruptions targeting critical economic infrastructure. These actions grabbed headlines and forced the issue into public consciousness in a way standard lobbying couldn't.
And these blockades, from the perspective we're exploring, are extremely powerful, aren't they? Because they hit the settler colonial state exactly where its lifeblood flows, the economic system that relies on constant movement, extraction, and capital accumulation.
They function on two levels simultaneously, as both a negation and an affirmation.
Okay, untack that. The negation part seems clear.
The negation is essentially an economic insurgency. By blocking critical infrastructure railways carrying goods, highways moving resources, or commuters, they directly impede the flow of capital. They disrupt the circuits of accumulation that rely on indigenous lands and resources. It makes the ongoing process of dispossession economically inconvenient, even costly for the state and for capital.
It creates leverage. And the affirmation part.
The affirmation ties back directly to that concept of grounded normativity we discussed with the dean. These blockades aren't just acts of protest against Canada, they are simultaneously enactments of Indigenous law and sovereignty. By physically stopping a train carrying oil through their territory or blocking access to a logging site, activists are asserting their own jurisdiction. They're enacting their responsibilities derived from Indigenous legal orders to protect the land, the water, the non-human relatives. They are practicing their relationship with the land, asserting that it should not be exploited in these ways based on their own inherent ethical and legal framework, independent of Canadian law.
So it's a profound shift. It moves beyond demanding recognition from the state towards actively enacting self-determination and jurisdiction on the land, regardless of state approval.
That's the transformative potential seen in such actions, which moves us logically into our final major section, thinking about what genuine decolonization might look like, shifting focus from state-centric recognition towards processes of resurgence and, crucially, radical self-recognition within Indigenous communities.
But before we get fully into that future-oriented vision, we have to address some internal challenges and critiques that often come up, specifically around the idea of cultural essentialism.
Yes, this is a really important and often sensitive part of the conversation around resurgence. Critics, both external and sometimes internal, worry that movements focused on identity and cultural revitalization can become essentialist.
Meaning they might promote a rigid, unchanging definition of who belongs or what authentic culture looks like.
Exactly. And that this can sometimes lead to exclusionary practices or even authoritarian or patriarchal dynamics within the nation or community where certain elites control the definition of tradition.
It's a valid concern in any identity-based movement. But the sources we're drawing on add a crucial layer. They warn that simply leveling the charge of essentialism often fails to grapple with the colonial context that creates the very conditions for these internal fractures in the first place.
Absolutely critical point. We simply cannot analyze the misuse of culture or exclusionary practices which absolutely happen and need to be challenged without referencing the colonial structures that have actively undermined indigenous governance systems and social relations for centuries.
Like the Indian Act, for instance.
The Indian Act is a prime example. It systematically imposed patriarchal governance structures, the band council system, directly replacing or marginalizing existing indigenous forms of governance, many of which were matriarchal or based on different kinship principles. It legally empowered men in ways aligned with colonial norms while disempowering women.
And we saw this play out so tragically, didn't we, in the history of Indigenous women who fought against gender discrimination in the Indian Act itself. Women like Jeanette Lavelle, Yvonne Bedard, Sandra Lovelace.
Yeah, these women were appealing to fundamental principles of gender equality, challenging rules that strip them and their children of their legal status and rights for marrying non-status men, rules that didn't apply equally to men.
Yet they face immense backlash from some segments of the indigenous political leadership at the time. They were accused of being inauthentic, assimilated, even anti-Indian. Why? Because their fight for individual rights was seen as undermining the collective right of the group to self-determination and control over its own membership.
It created this awful double bind, forcing a choice between gender equality and collective rights, a division actively fostered by the colonial legislation itself. So the core challenge for a decolonial resurgence, as these sources argue, becomes twofold.
Okay.
First, yes, fight settler colonialism externally, but second, and equally important, critically examine and stop reproducing the racist and sexist misrecognitions, as one scholar puts it, within indigenous struggles themselves.
So a genuine resurgence has to be critically self-reflective. It needs to be actively anti-patriarchal, anti-essentialist, and anti-exploitative from the inside out, especially given the horrific ongoing crisis of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people.
Exactly. It can't just be about restoring some idealized static past. It has to be about revitalizing values and practices in ways that are just and equitable for all members of the community here and now.
And this self-reflective resurgence, it also needs to grapple with the spatial realities of colonialism today, right? Especially the fact that more than half of the Indigenous population in Canada now lives in cities, often disconnected from reserve lands.
That's another huge piece. Historically, Canadian cities were conceived, legally and ideologically, as explicitly non-native spaces. Reserves were where Indigenous people were supposed to be contained.
Right.
That historical exclusion has a very clear modern economic parallel in processes like gentrification and urban development. These often operate under an implicit logic that some scholars have termed urbs nullius.
Urbs nullius. Urban space considered empty or void of indigenous sovereign presence, that's directly mirroring the logic of terra nullius, the empty land doctrine used to justify the original theft of territory centuries ago. That's a chilling connection.
It is. It frames urban space as inherently non-indigenous, which then justifies displacing racialized and low-income populations, including urban indigenous people, for redevelopment. Land designated as underutilized or blighted in the city gets targeted for reinvestment and gentrification, often pushing indigenous people who migrated there seeking opportunity or escaping colonial violence into further precarity and homelessness.
So resurgence can't just be about the reserve land base. It has to bridge that rural-urban divide, challenge urbs nullius, and assert indigenous presence and jurisdiction everywhere, including in cities.
Precisely. It requires forging new kinds of alliances, perhaps ensuring structured access back to land-based communities for urban members, and fundamentally recognizing that indigenous jurisdiction in relationship to territory doesn't end at the reserve border or the city limits.
Okay, so bringing all these threads together, the critique of recognition, the understanding of ongoing primitive accumulation, the importance of direct action, the need for internal transformation, the sources ultimately point away from that state-centric instrumental approach.
Yes, away from the logic of recognition politics.
and towards something called prefigurative politics. This sounds like the key concept for imagining genuine decolonization. What does it mean?
Prefigurative politics is essentially the idea that the means shape the ends. Instead of prioritizing strategic engagement with the state's legal and political systems, which, as we've discussed, always risks drawing indigenous peoples deeper into the logic of settler colonial rule, making them subjects asking for rights.
Right.
You prioritize internal transformation and self-actualization within the community or movement now. You enact or practice your desired political goals: decolonial, anti-capitalist, gender emancipatory, non-exploitative relationships in the cultural form, and the organizational structure of the struggle itself.
So you don't just lobby the state asking, can we please be self-governing according to our principles? You simply start governing yourselves according to those principles. You build the autonomous structures that reflect the decolonial future you want right here in the present.
That's the essence of it. You prefigure the desired future society in the way you organize and act today.
So what does scaling up look like? Moving beyond localized land defense actions or cultural camps towards building real sustainable alternatives to the dominant capitalist system.
The sources suggested involves at least three interconnected dimensions. First, and foundationally, it requires reconnecting people, especially youth and urban populations, to land-based practices, languages, and knowledge systems. That's grounded normativity in action.
Investing in programs that restore those indigenous legal and ecological understandings, which inherently challenge exploitative relationships with the land and each other.
Exactly. Second, it means actively cultivating economic self-sufficiency in ways that break the cycles of dependency on the often predatory settler economy, federal funding, resource extraction agreements, etc.
So developing truly sustainable local economies.
Yes. Things like community-owned energy projects, sustainable forestry or fishing enterprises, food sovereignty initiatives, worker-managed cooperatives, nonprofit social enterprises. Models that prioritize community well-being, ecological sustainability, and keeping wealth circulating locally, rather than maximizing external profit. These echo some of the Dean's original dismissed proposals.
They provide real economic security and autonomy by being accountable to the community, not distant shareholders or government funders.
Right. And finally, the third crucial piece is applying indigenous governance principles often emphasizing decentralization, participation, consensus building, relational accountability, applying those principles to all economic and social activity.
Not just reserving them for, say, ceremonial life or managing traditional pursuits.
Exactly. It means applying those deeply rooted ethical and political principles to running a modern business, managing community resources, making collective decisions about development, ensuring that the way things are done, the processes themselves, reflect those decolonial, anti-patriarchal, and non-exploitative values. The methods used in the struggle literally become the blueprint for the future society.
Wow, okay. This has been an incredibly dense, but I think really crucial deep dive into the critique of the liberal politics of recognition and the path towards a more radical, prefigurative form of decolonization. Let's try to quickly summarize the absolute key takeaways for you, the listener.
Okay. Firstly, we really establish why the standard liberal politics of recognition, while often well-intentioned, is seen as fundamentally problematic from this critical perspective. It primarily offers affirmative constrained reforms.
Reforms that leave the core structures of colonial power, settler sovereignty, and capitalist dispossession largely intact. Why? Because the recognition offered is always conditional, always granted by, and ultimately serving the interests of, the dominant power. The master defines the terms.
Right. Secondly, it's vital to shift our analysis and understand colonialism not merely as a historical event of past abuses that we need to reconcile with, but as a persistent ongoing structure. A structure primarily organized around accessing land through various forms of dispossession, that ongoing primitive accumulation.
And contemporary indigenous resistance, therefore, has to address this dual nature, fighting both the external structural dispossession of land and resources and the internal subjective legacy of colonization, including that imposed need for recognition from the colonizer.
And finally, the path towards truly transformative change, towards decolonization, as envisioned in these sources, requires a pivot away from primarily seeking state validation, towards a dual focus on, one, critical self-recognition.
Meaning resurgence that is actively anti-patriarchal, anti-essentialist, and based on internally generated self-determined principles.
And two, grounded, often disruptive, direct action, coupled with the patient, grassroots work of rebuilding autonomous, non-exploitative economies and political structures based on indigenous laws and that concept of grounded normativity. This prefigurative approach aims to build the alternative now, rather than asking permission from the colonizer.
Okay. Before we wrap up this deep dive, as always, we want to leave you with one final, perhaps provocative, thought to mull over, something that synthesizes this critical perspective. If we accept the core premise presented here that the underlying goal of the settler state, historically and often structurally today, remains the elimination of the native as a distinct political and legal impediment to accessing land, and if the means to achieve that goal have shifted over time, maybe from outright military force in the past, towards negotiation, co-option, complex legal agreements, and that quiet compulsion of economic relations today.
A shift in tactics, not necessarily an objective.
Exactly. Then the question for you becomes, how do you distinguish between acts of genuine transformative reconciliation that actually leads to the return of land, the restoration of freedom, the honoring of treaties in their spirit and intent, and what critics like the Mohawk scholar Tayaki Alfred forcefully warn might merely be a pacifying discourse? A sophisticated performance of recognition designed primarily to manage dissent and neutralize indigenous claims to sovereignty and land, ultimately serving to legitimize the ongoing colonial structure.
It's a challenging question.
It is, because if reconciliation, however well-funded or well-publicized, ultimately leaves the fundamental structure of dispossession untouched, does it actually heal? Or does it risk deepening the colonial wound under the comforting anesthetic of recognition? Something to think about.